we've talked about having a healthy meta is not just having a diversity of decks, but a diversity of play patterns.
Distraction makers.
So I've been watching a bunch of cEDH stuff lately. Post-ban, a particular play pattern has emerged, which revolves around tutor spells, clones, counterspells, and what are known as quality cards. I figured this was a good excuse to talk about quality and quantity cards. And this is a concept that was put forward by Vitor Damarosa, who is a pro Magic player from a decade back or so. They're sort of like deck building philosophy. You have a deck that is built around quality cards, which are cards that are individually quite powerful, or you have a deck that's built around quantity cards, which means that the individual cards are not necessarily the most that powerful, but in a quantity of them, they are quite strong. So his example is of the card Bitter Blossom, which is a card that at the beginning of your turn, you lose a life and get a fairy as a quality card. And then his example of quantity cards are something like Lightning Bolt. They're burn spells. It's not to say that those are the only two ways that you can build these ideas, but that's the starting point. cEDH exists in a world where only quality cards matter. Part of that has to do with the systems of Commander and how they have facilitated this experience. So I figured we should talk about how systems have created that outcome.
We're going to be using the term redundant cards a fair amount. So you want to quickly explain what redundancy is? Yeah.
Yeah. So redundancy
I think people hear us say that and think in like a negative connotation.
Right.
And it's not necessarily that.
No. So part of like a deck building strategy is if you have a particular thing that your deck does to win the game, you want to have as many ways to access that as possible. So we would call those redundancies. Whether that's a card that just has a different name, which means you can play 2 copies of it in Commander, or it's a card that is functionally a redundancy, which is a tutor spell or a clone spell or something similar to that.
In other formats, right, in past formats, the majority of the time, you would end up seeing decks that would have more of a quantity build to them. Maybe not even a majority, but you'd at least see it more often than just decks that are, I'm going to take all the most powerful cards and I'm going to shove them together, and that deck is just going to win the game because I have the strongest stuff, like Yu-Gi-Oh!
Yeah, a pile of good stuff in 60-card Magic does not usually function all that well.
I can't think of... I don't know a ton of old school Standard, but the closest example I could think of is like Siege Rhino back in the day. Siege Rhino was like one of those quality cards.
Very quality card.
Everyone just had it in their deck because it was just that good.
Well, and usually it's when a metagame starts to be warped around an individual card, that card is of such quality that everybody just wants to be doing that thing, right? And that connects right back to cEDH now with the card Rhystic Study. Rhystic Study is probably the highest quality card. Quality means an individually very powerful card. So let's talk about quantity for a minute and what that means from a deck building perspective. This also comes back around to the strategy circle, which is something we've talked about a lot, which is rush, economy, and defense. But what we need to talk about is the dynamics between these things, where a rush strategy values quantity over anything else because quantity ends up leading to consistency, meaning that if I'm just going to use red deck wins because it's the easiest example, but just bear in mind that this is not the only way to achieve a quantity strategy. In red deck wins, we don't really care what any of our cards are. They are functionally doing the same thing, which is roughly 3 damage to our opponent. So
3 damage for 1 mana.
For 1 mana.
As close as you can get to that.
And Magic's set points have been built around this idea, right? So we started sort of exploring what percentages of an individual card is drawn from a 60-card deck when there's 4 copies of each, and why those percentages are there. Like, why was Magic built with 20 life points, 60 cards, 4 copies of each? Because it didn't start there, right? It started with you can play as many copies of whatever you want. That is sort of the extremes of what quality could do, right? Those cards win you the game, but we're also in an environment where redundancy is at its most high, right? We can play in any number of quality cards. But then once we move into the sort of 60 card, 4 copies of each world, we now are finding the balance between these two ideas. I'm trying to find one particular card that wins me the game versus I'm trying to find a mass of cards that together win me the game, right? They're all functionally the same, but they all deal 3 damage for 1 mana, effectively.
You can probably see it also in Standard when tutors end up becoming viable. When players decide actually that it's viable enough to play tutors and pay an additional cost to go and fetch for a card to get it in hand and pay the mana cost for it, then you can generally get a sense of how strong the quality cards are in that particular rotation.
Previously, I've mentioned that like tutors in and of themselves are not particularly good cards, and I got a lot of pushback for it. So let's talk that through. When you exist in a world where these two things are in balance, a quantity deck will never play a tutor spell because they don't need it, right? In fact, it would make their deck strictly worse because they don't care about finding one individual quality card. They just care about having a critical mass of individually good enough cards to win the game at a certain point. Where if you have a quality deck that's built around a very specific card being very powerful, they might want a tutor spell. But again, you are balancing it with, okay, well, it's going to cost me this much more to go and search for that thing versus drawing it naturally from my deck.
And there's times that players will evaluate and decide that that's actually worth the additional cost to get that combination of cards.
And that's actually probably when the metagame has been skewed too far. The quality deck has been given enough leeway in the environment that they're not going to lose to the quantity deck, even though they're giving up efficiency to go search for the quality card with a tutor spell.
They're potentially taking an entire turn to go and prep themselves without actually having to push back.
And you can look at a tutor as, okay, well, the tutor represents the quality card that I want, but it's plus the mana of the tutor spell, right? And in a standard environment, tutor spells cost like 4 mana or something, right? So you're almost never going to do it. But okay, so now let's look at where Commander is at. Let's talk more specifically about the systems design of Commander and how it is facilitating quantity decks to effectively be non-existent and the problems that arise because of that.
I was going to say something that we always kind of talk about on here is that you have to look at the extremes of the system, and cEDH are players playing the system to its most extreme. And when all players at the most extreme are all playing generally the same type of deck archetype in this way, not the traditional deck archetype, but in this it's talking about quality decks, of decks filled with quality cards, then you might be able to see some sort of separation between, not a separation. What word am I thinking of? There's a problem. There's something wrong there. If everyone is let's just shove all the best cards together, and that's the way to win this game.
Yeah, and one thing we can compare it to as well is the vintage format, because the vintage format also has a restricted list, which means you can only play 1 copy of the cards. And part of that is because card quality is so high in the format that the best things you can do are just have a singular copy of these restricted cards and then also play tutor spells to go find them. So it's a similar environment in that way, except in vintage you still can have other decks that can play up to 4 copies of cards. It's not. I don't know a ton about the vintage metagame. I know Luris is like the best deck.
That's interesting.
But like a quantity deck could still exist in vintage, where the actual systems of Commander make it so that a quantity deck cannot exist, or at least not really.
Not currently, because technically the way that you've been describing it is that if you had enough redundancy, essentially. So if you wanted to play red deck wins, one, it just couldn't happen because of many other reasons we've talked about on this channel, but we won't get into that. But let's say in an ideal world, red deck wins for Commander would be you deal for 1 red 6 damage to each player, right? So let's just imagine that that's a common spell. You'd have to have a version of that spell for 100 cards, 99 cards, technically, basically, in order for that to be a worthwhile strategy.
Yeah. And there's a possibility here that there's a commander that could facilitate that experience, which basically could effectively turn all of your cards into that thing we're describing. I think Purphoros might be a decent example. Purphoros. Let's step away from burn for a minute, because I think burn is narrowing our scope of what a quantity deck means, right? Because cEDH at this point has effectively decided that Ristic Study is the best quality card in the format. It doesn't necessarily say I win the game, right? But it effectively says I win the game, as in I will have enough card advantage to be able to fight through my opponents being able to stop me from the Thassa's Oracle combo or whatever to win the game.
To the point that if you don't have that card in your deck, you're at a significant disadvantage.
Well, and it's not just that you don't have it in your deck, it's also if you don't have it in play, right? So
sure.
If you are, this is why clones have started to become ubiquitous, is that if you don't draw the card from your deck, one of your opponents might, and you've drawn redundancy of the thing, and what that means is any clone effect that can clone one of your opponent's permanents is effectively an additional Ristic Study.
Which I was surprised to see this. I just made a Kinnan deck, and I saw on the list there's Mockingbird and Copy Enchantment and stuff like that.
Mockingbird can't.
No, not for enchantments, but it'll clone an Esper Sentinel.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You're basically saying, okay, well, if any of my opponents have drawn the best quality card, I now have a copy of that. I have a redundancy in my deck, which is just weird.
Has that ever been in standard format where clones are the thing to do?
I mean, clones have been around and been in
Sure.
standard, but I don't think it's ever really been the best strategy that you could use. So I'm a quantity strategy that isn't burn. What this could mean is that you can move through your deck in a way to get to your quality cards in a quantity kind of way. My best example here is probably Dredge, in that it doesn't matter which Dredge card I draw as long as I have one of them, and then I can move through my deck and get to whatever I want to get to.
You're increasing the odds that you can have your deck do the thing you want your deck to do.
Right. And I'm doing that through redundancy. And in some ways, that's kind of what we're seeing with the Ristic Study idea, right? Is that, okay, well, Ristic Study is the best thing I can be doing. How do I get as many Ristic Studies as I possibly can get? And so we end up with these decks that are just however, as many possible Ristic Studies as possible. So I guess my question then becomes, why has the Commander system created that outcome?
We've talked about the 8th card problem on the channel, and the fact that you always have your Commander available is that in a quantity deck, a standard, there's no Commander, obviously, but in a quantity deck, there's almost no point in you having what would potentially be considered a quantity Commander, which is you trying to do what your deck does more efficiently. Instead, what it makes more sense to do is have a Commander that's going to generally provide value that is still going to have your deck do its thing better. But, in the example, like your cEDH deck, cEDH is the thing that basically provides the value for you. And your deck is the thing that is creating that value based around her. But you're never going to have the equivalency of a lightning bolt, right, as your commander. You're never just going to have another Dredge card as your commander.
Your commander is never going to be a quantity card,
right?
Because you always have access to it, you're going to find the best quality commander that you can play. Part of the sort of systems design of commander that has facilitated this is that the set points, right, the 20 life, the 60 card, the 4 copies of a card has been skewed so far away from quantity being even a possibility that all we have left is, okay, well, let's lean into quality. Right? There's no way to create enough consistency to create a different kind of play pattern other than I'm searching for what is the highest quality card in my deck, or I'm copying the highest quality cards from my opponent's decks. And then on top of that, I've got counterspells and then something that wins the game. And that's just sort of the structure we're starting to see from every successful cEDH deck, is that in order to get back that consistency, they're just trying to figure out how to get as many copies of the best thing in the format as they can.
So how do we fix this?
Unfortunately, if we're going to keep using the burn example, I don't even think that's a path forward, probably, because you would need to have a lightning bolt that deals 6 damage to each opponent, and then you would need to have 80 copies of that, basically.
Right.
So the other option is to have a strategy that can go under all of these things, which is a quantity strategy that would help you get to the card that says I win the game, no matter which, and having a critical mass of those. So draw all the other cards in your opening hand, and all of those cards say something about moving you to the thing that wins the game.
Sure.
I don't know how else you do that.
As opposed to what currently ends up happening is that the majority of the time your opening hand in Commander usually is, what is my draw engine and do I have enough mana acceleration? Even in casual Commander, I think that's what most people usually are deciding is maybe do I have a turn 1 or turn 2 drop or something as well. But it's basically, can I get my Commander out?
Well, and like you said, it's like, okay, in 1v1 60 card, the thing that you ask yourself about your opening hand is, how does this hand win me the game? Right. Like, how do I win? But in cEDH, that's not really what you need to ask. You need to ask,
am I going to get more value?
How do I draw the most cards?
Right.
Right? Because that inevitably will win me the game.
Sometimes you can just draw the combo, right? Like I could just get Basalt Monolith in my opening hand with Treasure Vault or whatever with Kinnan, and I'm fine. But that's very rare and not going to be super common.
Right, but the fact that it's in there, it can happen.
Yeah.
And you can win the game really early. But yeah, most of the game at this point is sit around and wait for a window to win the game.
And I think the thing that's really interesting to point out is that bans, I don't think will even fix this.
No, they won't. This is a systemic problem. A ban is just going to move the goalpost. So
it's actually about adding more cards, not about removing cards, which is interesting. It's there's possibilities that, yes, banning something like Rhystic Study or banning Smothering Tithe, banning these things that are considered generally as the highest value cards in the format will potentially sort of move the needle back a little bit.
Yeah.
But
so right. So the thing that's weird is we can look at Rhystic Study and say Rhystic Study is so far out ahead of any other quality card that banning it might bring the quality down, right, generally. So then it just will then default to whatever the next best card draw engine is. So you need to look at, okay, well, how do we introduce new mechanics, new cards into the environment that move us back to this strategy that is supposed to be keeping economy in check, which is rush. How do I win the game in a quantity way, in a consistent enough way that these decks don't have enough time to sit around and wait to draw their win condition?
There might be some, like we're saying, is that there's the possibility that bans can move the needle back far enough where if you can extend that timeline that it would take a quality deck to actually win, that a quantity deck could squeeze in if there's the card pool available to them to fit in to win on turns maybe 1 to 2, where a quality deck would win 3 to 4.
Well, and it's also not. So, like, quantity decks are not necessarily always aggro decks, right? It's just that you're playing in a way that
so
is
they'd
like
have to win in a
redundancy.
similar pacing to other decks,
right? And the most efficient way to beat 3 opponents at once that have 40 life each is to beat them all simultaneously without affecting their life totals, right? It's just I win the game button.
So it's possible then that even with all of this, because of the bigger issue of having to defeat all opponents, that it might just always be most efficient to go and tutor for things, unless maybe there is some. It'd be interesting. It's an interesting design challenge to find what would be a mechanic that would only benefit a quantity deck that is an inevitable I win. And maybe it is something that it's as you're drawing through your deck, maybe some cards get added to a card and it's like a countdown timer or something like that, then leads to the victory or something.
Like we were talking about earlier, Purphoros gets like kind of close here because Purphoros turns any card you draw into 2 damage to every player.
Oh, it's whenever you draw a card?
It's when you put it into play. So as long a creature. Whenever a creature comes into play,
gotcha.
You deal 2 damage to each opponent. So in that way, Purphoros is turning all of your cards into quantity cards, right? You are stapling a shock onto every, better than a shock to each opponent, to every creature that you put into play. So you could build this in a way that is, I don't care what I draw because everything I draw has a shock stapled to it. So there might be something there. Like that might actually be what we're talking about. Again, that's a burn strategy of doing that, but you could do that through other means.
Regardless of whatever the solution is that this would be an interesting sort of indicator when evaluating the meta to understand, like, is there even an opportunity for a deck to exist in this way? Or are all decks just going to need to have tutors and go and search for these best cards? Because if there isn't a deck that isn't doing that, then it means that there's no opportunity for decks to compete at that same pace, right? They cannot win the game as quickly as these other decks can. we've talked about having a healthy meta is not just having a diversity of decks, but a diversity of play patterns. And right now, not that we've personally dabbled super deep into playing our own cEDH decks at this point, but you've been watching quite a bit of cEDH. I'm more on the outskirts, kind of watching it every now and then. But yeah, really, it seems like very, very similar play patterns across the board. Whether you're playing Kinnan or you're playing Crom and Timnacrom, or insert partners here.
Yeah, a lot of the decks are all just kind of doing this same kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, I think game design wise, this comes back to the strategy circle. Like, how do you create diverse play patterns, right? You need play patterns that are at odds with each other and are on equal footing, and your systems design has to facilitate that. Right. You're not gonna. I don't even know if it's worth trying to like patch this with mechanics, right? Like individual card mechanics.
It would have to be like a hard counter in reaction to this. And I just don't think that it's
right, and that's not really creating a diversity of play pattern, because it's like, well, then that's the only thing that you can play that counters this other thing, and you end up in like an affinity meta or whatever, where people either play affinity or they play the thing that counters affinity, and so that's kind of where cEDH is at this point. It's like, well, you're going to be playing Rhystic Study. That's the best thing you can do. Copy it as many times as you can. I do wonder if a counter to that might emerge, but that's not a diversity in play pattern, right? That's you're either doing the thing or you're doing the thing that beats the thing, right? So coming back to the strategy circle, I think understanding that this sort of rock, paper, scissors idea is at a higher level than the decks themselves, right? We're zooming out further, and these are the three sort of rock, paper, scissors things that keep themselves in check, so that we ensure that, okay, we might have a rush strategy. Those rush strategies can look different, but they are keeping economy strategies in check. And if your systems design has interrupted this strategy circle, you're going to either have to discover a new way to do that, which could be possible, or you're going to have to augment your systems to be able to facilitate this balance. Well, thanks for listening to us talk about quality versus quantity cards. If you like this video, give us a thumbs up at the bottom. If you want more videos like this, you can subscribe. And if you want to talk about any of the things that we discuss on the channel, you can join our Discord. The link is in the description. We'll see you in the next one.